What up, everybody? I'm so excited to have Brian on. You know, along the way, you get to meet so many incredible people when you podcast. You all have heard me say this 1,000 times, but it continues to be true, Brian. And with your line of work, you must meet incredible people as well. You're an entrepreneur. You've been in the AI space for ages. And I should also, really what I should do is shut up and say, Sandra, thanks for coming on. I always love to co-host. Tell us why we have Brian on today.
Well, Brian is an amazing mathematician and cyberneticist, and he breaks down data in a way that is understandable. I kind of wish Brian had been my math teacher in high school, because I'm actually learning a lot about math today that it just makes it, real relevant and approachable. And what Brian does with all these amazing math skills is he builds really cool products. So looking forward to hearing the conversation and just being a fly on the wall. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, fantastic. Brian, what do you think of that intro?
It's way too much. I mean, you know how like every person who has reached a level of success in their life feels like an imposter? Or maybe not everybody, but I think most decent people feel like an imposter. I feel like an imposter all the time. It's true, I've done fun stuff, and I've met some really cool people, and I've been exposed to some really exciting experiences, but you're always sort of like, yeah, but like they say, the more you learn, the less you know, and I definitely feel that. But that assumes, of course, that I've learned anything.
Yeah, right. Which is exactly what you're supposed to say when you realize you know a lot of things, you realize you know nothing. But yeah, that is another benefit too of the show, is to be able to share with people like what you actually have done, because it is hard for you to recognize your own success, and we are a little unfair and hard on ourselves, and whether it's imposter syndrome or just not looking back and appreciating, damn, I have done all these things. And we didn't even talk about like your other hobbies and interests that are also fascinating as well too. Give us more of a well-rounded approach. Obviously businessman, AI, mathematician type person, but what else makes Brian Brian?
I'm a dad. I mean, that's huge, right? Just like you don't, friends of mine who haven't had kids, it's hard to explain to them how incredibly important having a child is, and how, like I would tell people, take your worst high school crush, double it, and that is every day with your kids. Like the amount of love you feel and infatuation you feel every day with your kids. And that is probably the most defining thing about me when I sit and I think about what I enjoy in life. It's definitely my wife and my kids. And so that's one thing I think that is probably one of the more defining things. And one of the things I love about, I shouldn't say it this way, but one of the things I'm appreciating about COVID, one of the silver linings, is seeing everybody and their families. Like I was on 2 calls yesterday where the kids came running through in the background, and I just love that. Like, to me, that connection with people, that's what we are as a species. We're a social species. So I definitely like that. I also, I'm a musician. I was a semi-professional musician for a while, and I still play Irish music occasionally. Pull out my Irish tenor banjo and go to the pub and drink some Guinness and play some tunes. That's a really important part of my life, just in identifying who I am to myself. And I play ice hockey. 2 of the members of my team, actually, I met on my ice hockey team. I don't play it well. So when people say, oh, you must be good, I am not. I am very not good.
How would you describe your game? Like what value do you bring to the ice for your team?
Comedic relief.
Okay.
Yeah. No, the only thing I have going for me, I'm slower, I'm like not a really great player. The only thing I feel like I have going, and my team will support this, is that I tend to get in the way really well. So I play wing, and when we're in transition game in the middle ice, I can stop a lot of people. That's really what I do well. So I can get there and get in the way a lot.
The gate.
What was that?
You're the gate. I'm the gate. In the way, exactly. Like, oh, I can let you by now. Yes.
Right. They call it the left wing trap for a reason, and I do that. So, and I'm also just sort of a generally curious person about all kinds of science, especially biological sciences and mathematical sciences. So, if I were to go in order of things that are important to me, definitely, family, mathematics is way up there. I just enjoy it. Science, ice hockey, Irish music, good beer, and traveling. And that sounds really boring, right? But you think about
not at all.
Okay,
Sounds fun. It sounds like a great life.
well, I'm not like, biohacking it or something like that. And you think about like, that's what life is, right? That's what the good parts of life are, is these moments you have. In game theory, they have this notion of games in the large and games in the small. And everything is a game in the small. When you break it down, it's all a game in the small. It's an interaction between like the three of us right now. You'd never really have, or infrequently have, an interaction with a million people at a time. And so you think about, if those moments, those real in the small moments, are satisfying or rich moments, then you're living a satisfying and rich life. That's where I try to put my mind a lot when I'm frustrated by events in the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a lot of events in the world, whether it's COVID,
Yes.
or racial injustice protests or anything. There's always things to concern ourselves with. And it's so when you say like your list is boring, I think it's remarkable. I mean, I think you listed 7 things off the top of your head that you are, and had them
Mm,
rank ordered. And that's, some people would struggle to do too, like they can really get down on themselves. So it's good to have someone saying, these are the things that I like and I do. And I'm not even a good hockey player. It's like, I can play the guitar, I can play the harmonica, but I'm not good at them. You wouldn't, if you're a musician, you'd be like, yeah, you can play a bunch of open chords. That's really good. But
right.
no thanks on jamming with us, because I don't know the rules, so
Right. Yeah.
it's a good thing. You talked about math and
Mhm.
looking at, just problems and solving those things when we talked before off mic. And I'm curious what your thoughts are when, we see all the COVID modeling and the struggles we've had, because the people who don't understand modeling, and I only have just slightly better than a layman's, ability to talk about this, but models are the starting point. It's like the
Mhm.
cone for a hurricane, but even broader. We're like, it's kind of a fan, it's a circle, and we don't really know. But talk about the challenge of doing something like modeling on a global scale for a pandemic with a bazillion variables.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that is often not communicated when we're doing science communication and mathematical communication is that science is a way of explaining what we see and trying to predict what we might see next. We're not speaking about a fundamental truth of the world. We're talking about stuff that we've seen and trying to predict. And so that's hard. And there are certain things that seem really easy, like if I open up my hand and my keys are in it, they're going to fall. That seems like a really easy way to sort of conclusion to make. When you're dealing with things like an epidemic, there's a lot of complex variables happening there. There's a lot of things that you have to consider and interacting effects. So, recently there was this hype about this thing where the cubic model came up and came out of public policy. We came up with a cubic model of the pandemic. And what does that mean? That means that, and I'm just to be slightly technical for a second, that means that it's a third order polynomial. It goes like x cubed plus x squared plus x plus a constant. So it's a third order polynomial. And it is, to professionals who study epidemics, absolutely wrong. It doesn't make any sense. And I put together a blog on that where I sort of showed some visualizations why it doesn't make sense. And it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to be wrong. But when you're dealing with things that are so important, I mean, these are crucial, right? When you put together a bad model and you say to the world, hey, this is all going to go away like magic, and if it was me just saying this out of my office in Highland Park, it'd be one thing. But when you're saying it from a national stage, it's another. The mathematics around how to model an epidemic are well studied. They have been around. Epidemiology has been around for a very long time, and there's a famous plot. I think it was a guy's name was Snow. Somebody's going to correct me on this, but I think his name was Snow, and he plotted how a well had created an epidemic in a small London town. We know what to do. We know how to do it. People have been doing it for almost a century or over a century. And it involves some harder math. So when you abuse the mathematics like that for a political point, it makes me very angry, honestly, because it's irresponsible. You want to iterate towards good solutions, but when a good solution exists, that's where you want to iterate from, right? Standing on the shoulders of giants, every scientist talks about it. Like, we see far only because we stand on the shoulders of giants. And people have been here before, using differential equations, using epidemiological models, using dynamical systems to figure out how a pandemic might spread. And that knowledge was hard won and should be respected. So if anybody's interested, they can jump over to our blog at Verdant AI, and I have a whole exposition with a little bit of mathematical profanity. A friend of mine called it math wrath. um, around how this is done correctly. You know, how forgive the phrase, but how a grown-up approaches these sorts of problems. They're important problems. They need to be correctly modeled.
I told Sandra she could have the next question, but I'm going to jump in on her real quick. When you're putting these equations together,
okay, go ahead.
and I swear to God, you could have the next one. But
swear to God,
do you go to account for things like do you put a giant kappa for crazy and political influence? Because you cannot solve a big problem like this if both sides are pulling at each other. You know, I mean, look at the mask conversation has changed. I think last time I counted was 10 times. So I don't know what to believe. I don't know what'll be true tomorrow. And then I've got these political factions pulling at my interest and my solution set. I mean, look at how challenging it is to look at. You're in LA County, I'm in Orange County, Utah, 3 totally different outcomes for how this works. And then politically, 3 different places too.
Right. Well, I'm 51 years old. I've been doing mathematical modeling for a long time and AI for a long time. I remember back in the 80s a show called the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, which some listeners may or may not remember, but it was a news hour. It was a news program on PBS, and they were famous for doing, balanced arguments. They'd have in somebody from one side of the spectrum, somebody on the other side of the spectrum, and then the listener was encouraged to think critically. The listener was encouraged to follow the argument and develop their own opinion. And that is what is not being encouraged by the media anymore. Even with my, I have a particularly left bent on my politics, but I don't even feel like the left-wing media is encouraging me to think critically through problems all the time. Sometimes they are. And I know the right-wing media is doing the same thing with their listeners. They're encouraging them on some issues to think critically and on other issues to not. As a scientist, I try to obey that tradition of sort of methodological thinking, of data-driven, evidence-based, hypothesis-based thinking. And I have to remind myself that the majority of people trust scientists. That's true still to this. 538 just did a great poll on that. People still trust science. Science is not a natural way to think about things. And additionally, somebody pointed out recently, I think it was David Deutsch, the physicist, pointed out that science is less than 100 years old. Like the scientific thinking, like how we do science, not like the act of collecting evidence, but the actual scientific method is less than 100 years old. So people haven't had enough socialization on how to think critically like that, and they're not getting it as much. But as my buddy Dan Sorger likes to point out, this is a good time to be alive. And the debates that we're sparking and the conversations we're having, even if they're highly polarized, are really bringing us to a point where we're all realizing that I think a lot of people are realizing that they're hyperpolarized, and now we have to go back to this critical thinking, this sort of deliberative thought, a scientific way of thinking, and start seeking out things more like McNeil-Lehrer News Hour rather than whatever extremist media that you're interested in pursuing. And I feel like that's happening in my personal life. I've been learning to be a lot more tolerant of people with strongly opposing views, even things that I find extremely like core ideology, around like sexual identity or racism. Those are things that I'm very opinionated on, and in the ways you would expect. But trying to hear why, when somebody reacts towards some sort of identity issue, why they react that way, and trying to understand, can I unpack where they're coming from and get to the root issue? Because I don't think people aren't born racist; they're taught to be racist. But actually, that's even I'm going on too long. But that's even too much of a trope, because people kind of are born racist in a certain way.
Yeah.
We know that there's xenophobia that is sort of implicit in animals, in every mammal that comes before us. So there's got to be some sort of xenophobia within us because we're a natural creature. But you can train that out. And why wasn't it trained out of some people? Why wasn't it socialized to a better world? Not sure, but we can do it. We know we can do it. So I'm going to pause there because I feel like I'm getting really soapboxy right now.
Yeah, you actually talked about so many different things, and I always appreciate your perspective, because I do think it is based, a lot in the, the scientific method, which is, really, drives everything, your foundation, I guess. But there's a few things that, I think are interesting. I love that you said that, that being a dad is your number one motivating factor. And I think that explains a lot about, I think your curiosity about the world and your openness to accept new ideas, and also, what you pursue, from a business perspective. So I'd love to just kind of, unpack that a little bit, about, what I really think that you're an individual that sees it as your responsibility to leave the world a better place. I just kind of, I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, I think if you go to the Verdant website, of course, you see that we're a values-driven organization. And my father was a prosecutor, and my father was not a role model. I'm going to be upfront about that. My father was not a role model, but he did fight for justice, and that was one of the things that was core to his worldview on one level. On another level, it was not core at all. And you look at this dichotomy of what it means to be a value-driven person and what it means to have gone through the experiences I've had that have trained me on some really, really specific skills, on things that not a lot of people have had access to learn. I went to one of the best universities in the world for mathematics. I've studied at under some of the greatest minds in the field. I have been part of enormous institutions. I've been very, very lucky to learn from a lot of people and learn things that are inaccessible to a lot of the population. People aren't really going to get the chance to learn the level of mathematics I've learned, or the experience at the government organizations or institutions I've been at. So I feel fortunate in that, and I feel that it all comes down to Spider-Man, right? Like with great power comes great responsibility. And I don't know if I have great power, but I have abilities that other people haven't had a chance to learn, and maybe someday they will, and I hope they do. But now that I have those, if I have this ability to affect change in a positive way, I'm obligated to do so. I feel obligated to do so. And if you're saying where does that obligation come from? Well, I'm a dad, right? I have a world that's coming after me that I need to preserve for my children and my children's children and your children. Mm-hmm. And honestly, the people I'm living with now, not just the future. I'm not ignoring the fact that there's a lot happening in the world. So with all of that on a more practical level, Verdant is an opportunity for myself and my team to do value-driven things, to do things where we decide we're going to do this effort, even if it's not going to be as lucrative, because it has a positive impact on how we want to see the world progress. And so we work a lot in clean tech. We're working in agricultural tech endeavor right now, where we're trying to help with carbon sequestration and reversing climate change. And we're doing that through market forces. I believe that you have to use market forces wisely. I don't think that the government can come in by fiat to fix things. So we have a project we're calling Biomass One, where we're helping people reuse agricultural waste and either sequester carbon or create clean energy. And in doing so, we're creating a whole economy where people can do the right thing with their land and also be profitable. And one of the things I like to point out is that many of these farmers know that they're doing the wrong thing when they're covering their crops with pesticides. I mean, I don't know if you heard about the soybean thing this morning or last couple of days. They know they're doing the wrong thing, but they don't have much of a choice. And they know that if they can do the right thing, they have better land to pass on to their children. So that intergenerational transfer is really important. And we want to make sure that we can participate in that. And that's one thing we're interested in. And we have half a dozen others in digital health, in social justice. These are things that are important to us that Verdant really stands for. And we're spending as much time as we can on those projects.
We had Dr. Stephen Running on the show a couple of times. He won the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore in, I think, 2006, wasn't that when they won that? Yeah, and he's a climatologist at University of Montana. And I was asking him, because we talk a lot about global climate change. Mm-hmm. And this is an aside, but this was kind of a funny aside. Like during the last couple of weeks, we've learned two things. that we didn't know before because of COVID and then the panic, and then also all of the social rights, the horrors of George Floyd being killed.
Mm.
The Second Amendment argument is largely over because you have to know that police cannot always show up and protect you. Like we've sort of seen that now. And we also know that humans have a direct impact on the environment because we've all been driving less and the earth is thanking us for it. So
Mhm.
you have to juggle these complex social concepts, that are not easy to get through. When you look at problems, from the mathematical sense, and the farmer's like, hey, I've got to make this much money per hectare to exist,
Mhm.
to do it. How do you help them as a mathematician? How do you help them solve that problem? Because it's scary to look at change. Farmers are conservative by nature because what they do works. Why am I going to mess with it? And yet with that
Mhm.
said, they've got robot tractors and all kinds of ways. Combines exist for that reason. How do you approach that mathematically to figure out what it takes to make someone spray less pesticides or, you know,
Mhm.
process their land in a different way? Because it's one thing to say, look out for our kids in the future, but it's another thing to produce a reliable and repeatable,
Right.
right? Scientific method result,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And make predictions that you can execute. So
right?
yeah, farmers have to play a much longer game than most of us do, right? Most farms get contracted out for the next 5, 10, sometimes even 20 years. Like if you're going to grow poplar trees, you're doing a 15-year contract. So you're going to invest in what's going to happen 15 years from now. And I was talking to a guy in Georgia who's part of the Georgia Forestry Commission, and he was talking about how a lot of the farmers in this the southwest or southeast feel like they got a raw deal because 20 years ago they were told plant trees and we will buy the trees and we'll have carbon sequestration and everything will be great, and they did, and now they have this land full of trees they can't really sell. There's just too much on the market. Aren't enough purchasers. Logistics and supply have been disrupted even before COVID. So now they're feeling really frustrated. They did the right thing and they knew that they wanted to do the right thing, but now the market isn't supporting them. And that's, disheartening to all of us. These are people who are not making huge windfall profits every year. Maybe with the large aggregate farms are, but these are hardworking people who are, have to watch a budget and have to play a long game, which is a harder thing than most people who have a 9 to 5 have to deal with. They don't have to play a long game. Where am I going to be in 5, 10, 15 years from exactly where I am? Am I going to keep my office job for the next 15 years? Probably not. They're going to be on that same office for the next 15 years. So in terms of how do you approach that mathematically, I would say you don't really approach it mathematically. On my LinkedIn profile, I like to put mathematical entrepreneur. And so I like to consider myself a bit of both. I like to consider myself a lot of things that I'm probably not, but just ask my kids about all the things I'm not. But the entrepreneurial side is to look at this and say, this is a problem in the market. How do we create a more dynamic market? And then that's where the math comes from at that point, where you say like, well, if I can optimize the supply chain here, I can create more liquidity and they can move value that they have on their land. They can move that value into the market. And so there's optimizations to be done there from an algorithmic point of view. That is not really the focus with Biomass One at the moment. We're building to that. Our focus right now is to just immediately enable people the opportunity, or give people the opportunity to sell their agricultural waste. Like for instance, cow manure is actually a very valuable asset. You can use it. You can put it into a digester and create clean natural gas. You can dehydrate it and create fertilizer. The problem is it has a limited sort of range that you can sell it. So if you're going to pick it up, you can't sell it to somebody 300 miles away because it's just not worth the shipping. The freight comes in, and that's the big limiter. But if you can sell it to somebody 15 to 20 miles away, or under 60 is sort of the rule of thumb with a lot of these things, then you sell it to them, they can get it cheaply, and then you've created an asset on your farm, and you've provided them with a cheaper alternative to buying gas or buying fertilizer. So the reason people aren't doing that is it's really difficult to connect buyers and sellers. So the number one thing to do is to connect buyers and sellers within your region, within a certain logistical parameters. There are constraints you have to deal with, but we know because Wendy Owens, who's been heading this charge, We know that people need that. We know that when we say, hey, you should meet this person, they'll buy your stuff, they buy it. Liquidity occurs. And so that's the first thing we're trying to solve. Then we're dealing with sort of the mathematical optimization problem afterwards.
And then the bigger question, back again to Dr. Stephen Running, when I asked him, I said, global climate change sounds like the war on terror, sounds like the war on drugs, sounds like the war on poverty. What? Like, no shit. What is the goal here? Like, what are we going for? You're the climatologist. And he said, we need to get, for a goal, and then we can work from there, we need to get I think it was 400 parts per million, way above the historic norm. But with modern technology, we can probably manage that. And that's a doable thing. So one, let's quit burning coal. When I give you that from one of the smartest climate minds in the world, how do we do that? Is that where the market is oriented? You know, I mean, just, and not to attack what you guys are doing, but this is science, right? It's hard. So as soon as you say carbon sequestration, you know, and someone's like, we've got kelp ladders, and then I read an article from a peer-reviewed journal that's like, hey, kelp ladders are creating more gas than we thought. We realized, like, now it's not kelp ladders, and you know, because science turns out science is not exact; it moves around. Right. So when I give you the number 400, you know, what do you think about that? How do you fall in line with that, or is that not what you guys are trying to do goal wise?
Well, you know, we're trying to get there. We're trying to support that. We're trying to support many of the goals, and acknowledging that there's a couple things at play. First of all, science is not exact, right? Like, it's an iterative process. The important thing about it is not deciding that the paper you read last week is the be all end all. It's deciding that the paper you read last week is a step along the way to greater understanding of what we need to do. And being tolerant of the fact that that person might have been wrong, or that person might have been right. You might have been wrong and they're right, you know, and there's a whole truth table that goes on. And that's really a challenge, I think, just back to the earlier part of our conversation around having a deliberative mindset. And by deliberative, I mean, you know, procedural, thinking through the arguments, respectfully sort of understanding the axiomatic approach. So on that one side, you know, kelp ladders, really cool. It's interesting. I studied kelp in graduate school. That's what my graduate work was in. And you start to think, oh, maybe this isn't the solution. So where do we go next? How do we get to the solution? And when we talk about, you know, the war on drugs and these other massive pushes and climate change being like that, I agree. I think that one of the things, you know, we know that the war on drugs was not particularly successful. And part of that was, you know, were there real mandates there? Were there real incentives for people to clean things up? And was it beyond just sort of a government mandate? And I think that there's so much interesting stuff happening in the climate change arena right now, where people are trying to find market forces to affect climate change. And not all of them are going to be right, and some of them are really interesting, and some of them just seem kind of silly, honestly. But I like that people are experimenting. You know, there's some really silly ones out there. I like that people are experimenting with market forces to reduce carbon emissions. And one of the things that I've learned, you know, you're learning all the time. And one of the things that was interesting to me about carbon sequestration, we know that sequestration needs to happen because basically we did de-sequestration, and that's what got us into this mess, right? So we can get the carbon back into a fixed place. Then we know we can affect climate change. I mean, Los Angeles is a great example. Our air has been cleaned over the past 2 months. It's pretty amazing. And one of the ways you can sequester carbon is by using some wood alternatives in construction. So if you use like bamboo or giant reed, and you turn that into plywood, you know, what you would call plywood, you've now sequestered that carbon, and that carbon stays in a building for 100 years. If you can find concrete alternatives, like hempcrete is interesting. I don't know how it's doing, but it's an interesting idea that we're turning hemp into concrete. That sequesters carbon, right? So you can actually sequester carbon in buildings. And that is something I was not particularly aware of, honestly. And as I've learned about these market forces, you're thinking, well, you know, these wood alternatives are cheaper, they're more available, they're local, so that you can reduce the footprint of moving them from here to, you know, around the world. Those are great alternatives. Let's find 1,000 of those and pick up on 50 of them that work. And so Verdant is really about looking through as many of these ideas as we can, and trying to find ones that we understand, because there's probably some great ones out there that we don't understand, but trying to find the ones that we understand and we feel like we can contribute to and push that forward. So are we going to get to that 400 number? Well, hopefully we'll be a small part of that.
Yeah, if not like a drone like parachute slowing down the rise, and just
Right.
over time build up. Because you're right, there are 1,000 products created by 10,000 different people, and then we just keep doing that, and there are a lot of different solutions. One of the solutions, again, from talking to Dr. Running, is taking the efficiency of petrochemicals and really getting a lot more power out of it, and redesigning how we use, because part of the problem is that we're terrified of nuclear, and damn, petrochemicals are extremely powerful in terms of energy density, and it's
the energy is ridiculous. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So it's hard to ignore that, because that's always worth money. It's like saying, hey, platinum will solve the problem, but we're going to deal with plastic. It's really hard to get by that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there's there's a whole field. This is going to be really nerdy, because this is not where you expect me to take it, but there's a whole field of computational chemistry, right? That is interesting to me because it's computational, and I know I've had a couple years of chemistry in college. And it's being supported by the new advances in quantum computing. So like computational chemistry is heavily compute intensive. It's like even more so than weather forecasting, which people are already relying on high performance computing to accomplish. And now with quantum coming along, the computational chemistry is also coming along there. Now it's not ready yet. The quantum part isn't, but the computational chemistry is. And that is about how do I unpack methane or octane? How do I unpack that and retrieve as much energy as possible? Or how do I use blends of different materials to create octane that will unpack that? So that is a huge modeling problem that has been really mostly accessible only to the larger institutions because of the compute power. You need to spend you need a lot of electrons to do this. Now, there's a lot of motion in the high performance computing world right now. Including one of my favorites is this project called Chapel, out of the guys who built the Cray machines. And it's allowing people at home to do versions of high performance computing, which is pretty amazing. So all the SETI at home stuff is going to be accelerated by this sort of commoditized HPC. So when we're looking at how do we get the most out of a molecule, well, that's a chemistry problem. Right, and can be solved with math. Well, not solved. It can be approached with math. I hesitate to say anything is solved, but it can be approached with mathematically. Those are definitely endeavors that I'm interested in approaching. It is not something I'm actively working on right now. But you're right. The energy density of octane, of these sort of carbon-based fuels, is incredible. It's no match for the nuclear, as you pointed out. But nuclear comes with a lot of problems that I think are legitimate. I think that people are. I personally feel like nuclear power is fairly safe and fairly clean. Right. For the most part, there are still problems with it. It is one of those things that you can point to a specific place and be afraid of, which is not the same thing as petrochemical production, right? Like you can't point and go, oh my God. You can see the offshore oil rigs, but like if you started pointing at where you're afraid of petrochemical going wrong, it's the parking lot, the car is 50 feet from me right now. So I think it's become normalized. So I think it's natural to kind of go, oh my God, this is too scary. And then, if you watch Chernobyl, that was terrifying.
It sort of has had a Jaws effect, right? We have some, I'll say minor, if that's possible, meltdowns.
Right,
then,
right.
Yeah, you have that China syndrome and Chernobyl. It's terrifying, and you're more scared of nuclear than you probably should be.
Wow.
There was this book that came. Sorry, Sandra.
No, go ahead, please. I don't want to.
This book that came out about Renaissance capital called "When Genius Failed," and I guess the book probably came out 10, 15 years ago. And it's a story of long-term capital management, the company that amassed billions of dollars and suddenly failed. And part of the problem is that they were doing algorithmic trading on NASDAQ, and they became what the arc of the story is. They became so successful they couldn't trade with anybody else, and they fell apart. And the title, I read the book. It was a fascinating book, and it's a fascinating sort of account of what you could do algorithmically with mathematics and sort of time series analysis. But I get to the end of like genius didn't fail, like genius won in this one. Like the math won, the math worked, all of that stuff worked. What happened was a managerial catastrophe. right? Like they became greedy, they became concerned about their own careers, about their own returns. And that's exactly the story of Chernobyl, right? Like even independent of how the film portrayed it for dramatic effect,
Right.
These disasters are managerial problems, which are real problems, right? So you can point to science and go like nuclear energy is as clean as you want to say it is. It's fairly clean. It has waste. It's a problem. But you want to say, hey, it's super clean. We can't, there's no reason to be afraid of it. It's like, well, the people running it are the reason you should be afraid of it. And that can be improved upon, but I don't want to trivialize it either and say like, oh, people who don't believe in nuclear power are lame because they don't get it. It's like, they think they're responding to science, but really they're responding to is the lack of sort of correct management of it. That's the problem you really want to worry about. Who are the people that are pushing the buttons?
Yeah, but yeah, it was nuclear experts that blew up Chernobyl, right? Like, and that has happened. And then there's behavioral models, like they've done scientific study on this, where they say, Brian, here is the problem in Africa. You have to fix this problem. And you start twisting the knobs, and we get to this point where, as humans, we just start careening from left to right, and we overcorrect, which, we're seeing right now, like with our reactions to everything. We overcorrect and quickly lose control of the outcome. It's a dramatic, it's a dramatic thing to think about, like how often we're wrong, and totally incapable of understanding that's true.
Right. Well, the hard part is to appreciate being wrong, right? I mean, it's good to be wrong. I used to tell my kids when I was teaching them to ice skate, if you're not falling, you're not learning, right? It's just like, that's just how you have to look at the world. It hurts to land on your elbow, but that's how you have to look at the world. I remember when I was just learning to code, I came across some post. I was trying to figure out why my code wasn't compiling. And somebody said to me, yeah, you're viewing this wrong. When you get this the stack trace and you get the error log, you're viewing it as the enemy, when really it's your friend telling you exactly what the problem is. So every time it just barfs onto the screen that you've missed all these things and this is error here, that's your friend telling you what you're doing wrong. And that is the hardest thing to sort of appreciate. It's like, let's be wrong a lot. But let's be sympathetic when somebody else is wrong. No matter how horrific their point of view might seem to you at some point, be sympathetic. They're wrong for a reason. They have a reason for what they're doing. It might be a psychotic reason, might be pathological, but until you know that it's pathological, just assume that they have an actual legitimate analytic reason for getting there. Your point about Africa is interesting as well, in that I'm part of a group that does impact investment in Africa, and I'm on these calls called The Nest, organized by this guy named Jim Chu. He's really fantastic. He's done a great job. And one of the things that, I don't want to say is a criticism, but an observation I made is that when you have a bunch of people trying to invest in companies who are traditional investors, they have a set of values that they're trying to get to. And they're trying to get to returns. They want to get their ROI. They want to look at your run rate. And that's fine. But I think it's more fine if you're in California, right? If you're looking at these things that are, not seriously impacting the quality of life of everybody that's being affected. So it's a little bit of a luxury to think about, do I get a 3x return or a 5x return? I think that if you get a 1.1x return and you've improved somebody's lives, that's maybe how you should look at the world. So I'm on these calls and I'm sometimes like, I know why you're answering that question. It's a very good financial question, but are you in the right place if that's your instinct? I'll give you an example. Well, I won't give you a specific example, but I'll give you a theater of an example. One of the things I'm learning is that many of the African companies, the biggest thing that they're worried about is people getting killed on their mopeds, right? Or their scooters, or however they want to describe them. But apparently there's no emergency service in huge swaths of Africa. Surprise, surprise. It doesn't have the infrastructure that we do. If you get killed by a car, you don't have insurance. You have to pay for it yourself to go to the hospital. And there's a lot of startups that are trying to figure this out. Like, how do we provide medical assistance to somebody who just got hit by a car? And they have some ideas on how you can monetize that and make it pay for itself. Yeah. It's not going to make $1 billion, right? And if you invest in that, at worst, you're going to lose your $100,000, but probably at least one or two people are going to be better off. Yeah. And it's just like, it's a different way of looking at the world, that they are trying to adapt their questions in their business to a Western model of finance, as opposed to, and I don't like to use the term Western, but so like a Silicon Valley model of finance, as opposed to trying to find market forces that are implicit in their native economy that can be translated to an investment there. And I think there's a lot of work that's left to be done on that. Like, how do you use the native economy in a way that makes sense for the local economy?
Yeah.
You know?
This is vital, and I'm stomping all over Sandra. I apologize, Sandra.
No, don't even worry. It's fine.
So because of my work overseas, I've seen a lot of the problems that happen. Like we have these great solutions. For example, U.S. Ag will go out and try to help Africa, whatever it's going to be. But the ground truth is so far from the reality. So, there you are off in an office and you're saying, given this, then, doing if-then tests will have this positive outcome. I go out and I'm like, yeah, there's no fire department here. You're studying for stability. There's no ATM. There's no way to safely transmit money. There's no way to, and it's like, well, we didn't know all that when we figured the solution out. And it's the simplest, smallest, impossible for someone in an ivory tower. And God bless the ivory tower. We need those guys too. But when I would go out, I would say, what's the problem we can solve right now today? Like, what's one thing? And it was like, can you move this piece of concrete wall so our kids could go right across the street to school? And then we could do that. And now there is this solution that instantly created a micro improvement in stability,
Yeah, you and I had a great conversation the other day about these local sort of constraints that would not occur to me sitting in my office in Los Angeles. One of the constraints, and I hope you don't mind me bringing it up, but was culturally, people growing grapes. Have you shared that with your listeners? Can you retell that story? Because I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So basically, in Afghanistan, we had a program because we knew they grew grapes, and we're like, if you grow them on a trellis, they will produce better for you, and you'll get a higher yield on your crop. That's great and true, and they know that because they're grape farmers, and they know. But if they do that, it's an indication of Western influence, and it will get them targeted, if not killed. Like, it will draw attention. And even if that's not true, their perception is that the Taliban will recognize that, and my family's safety will be less. So here we have this thing where you can grow bigger grapes. However, it's not worth my life to do that.
Right. I find that fascinating on a lot of levels, on some levels that are horrifying, and on one that I want to kind of bring back to like a psychologically less frightening place. And that is, it's sort of the, when I introduce myself, I often talk about cybernetics. Cybernetics is the study of systems. And I often caution people around AI and machine learning that the system only knows what you tell it. And if nobody told somebody that like grape trellis is a social indicator that is vital, it's no AI in the world is going to figure that out, right? It's never going to figure that out. And so, this domain knowledge that you have from simple conversations, like in the small, like I talked about this earlier, like these moments in the small, unpack information, super, incredibly vital. It's like maybe the most vital piece of information that you obtained in that whole effort was like a 5-minute conversation with maybe one person. You write out the text and it's like 60 lines of text or something. So you don't, go ahead.
Yeah. The other thing is that we'll pour money into the bathtub trying to help, people out. But there are so many holes in the bathtub, the money just runs right through it because the problem we're trying to solve is more important than the bathtub being full of water. I hope that analogy makes sense, but you cannot fill the bathtub fast enough because there's so many needs. And we look at that like corruption, and then I'm like, no, we're corrupting. Like, we're filling this stupid bathtub full of money, and they're all desperate for what's in the bathtub, so they just drill holes in it. So you'll never fill the bathtub up, and you'll never be able to better place that money with a more deliberate approach. And again, get to the ground and find out what they need. And a farmer will say, feed and seed. Feed and seed. That's what I need. I'm not going to hire people. My family's going to bring in the crop. I'm never going to change that. Feed and seed. And we're like, they need apricots. They need access to the inner Asian market and all these other things. Yeah, feed and seed. That's what they need.
Right. now you're a poet. You sound a little Jesse Jackson right there. Feed and seed. That's what they need. And I think you're right. And I think that respecting that sort of sub-game, if you will, like, not to belittle it, game to me is an important mathematical thing, right? Not like a triviality. Respecting that sub-game, that these actors in this system have this immediate need, and that's all they're ever going to need. And that's what you need to obey. And then try to take one granular step back and say, like, with those as given methods, as given constraints, how do you create a system around them that supports them? As opposed to kind of going into their subgame and trying to change their rules. You know, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in business. I mean, people do it all the time. This is why a lot of like major projects I've seen in industry fail. Like the CEO decides that they're going to move everything to this data platform or whatever it is. And by fiat, it's just supposed to happen, but it doesn't respect all the subgames that are being played out throughout the organization. That's a much less dire example than the one you're using. I don't have that on the ground experience, and I'm slightly envious and slightly thankful I don't.
Yeah, and I like that you use fiat. Can we use the word diet? Like we had a diet in worms again, and we decided to save the world. Okay, so there's my diet and fiat joke. Let me ask you this. So when we deal with, because you guys deal with environmental type issues, I mean, we had Fabian Cousteau on, and he talked about how most of the air we breathe comes from the ocean. Like it's our lungs. Yeah. And yes, the Amazon's a big vital part of that, but you can't outdo the ocean. There's so much in it. And we haven't studied it like we want to study space and everything else. So we have this ocean system, we have this terrestrial system, and then we have the climate system, you know, and these are very interdependent things. We're trying to figure this out. And again, Dr. Stephen Running says, hey, great, go explore for petroleum, but as other gases leave, those are our natural resources. We demand you capture them and put them to work. Don't let them just fly into the atmosphere. Like if you're going to take this money and make it, you know, these are our resources, get that stuff, you know. So all these different systematic demands. And again, like we're not wanting less heavy metals. We want more of those things. So we're going to scratch more holes into the ground and tear down more mountains and all these other things. So how do we balance these systems, man, that are like the ocean is tough to get to. We want more and more metal for our day-to-day lives, and we're trying to get less carbon in the air, but we're not doing or demanding less of the earth.
Yeah, well, I know the answer. I'm just not going to tell everybody. So, so you know, maybe I'll share it.
Can it be that I get more carbohydrates? I would like it to be more carbohydrates for me, so I can eat some delicious desserts.
Yeah, it's French fries. I'm just gonna get. Well, you know, there's a certain my outside view of how these problems get addressed. I mean, my internal view is different, but there's a certain parochialism that happens when people are worried about their part of it. So like you just mentioned 3 major systems, right? Like we have you have the climate, we have the oceans, and we have the rainforest, right? Like the big 3, kind of the big 3 of climate change, right? Those are important systems. I think that there's a reason that people want to crawl down onto the bottom of the rainforest and look at the spores that are coming up and see their contributions. And there's a reason that people want to think about, you know, micro kelp that exists, like these tiny little algae that exist that are providing oxygen. Dealing at a higher, more complicated level is actually just, it becomes a very sophisticated system to study. And I think that that's challenging. I think that there's not a bridge between the guy who studies spores and the guy who studies climate change to think about an integrated system all the way up. From a compute point of view, it's really hard. You know, from a different system of differential equations point of view, also still pretty hard. The hardest part, though, is from an incentive point of view. You know, if somebody said to me that the only thing you have to do for the rest of your career is to work towards a unified climate model that incorporates the spores all the way up to the winds and, you know, the magnetosphere, I would be delighted. The problem is, you know, I'd have to get paid to do that somehow. My team would have to get paid to do that. That's just hard to do. And it would be 15 years before I could publish a single paper, right? So if I'm an academic and I'm rewarded on the number of papers I'm publishing, then I'm not going to get there. If I'm a businessman, you know, what am I going to do? I'm going to, you know, sell a webcam of me writing equations on the board. Like, it's just really, there's not a way to incentivize that behavior that's obvious to me. There's probably little micro incentives around the world, but I'm not seeing them. But it's definitely an effort we need to take on. We need to think about these larger integrated solutions. I do think that there's a new set of mathematical tools that have come out that have been repopularized in the last 10 years called mean field game theory. And mean field game theory talks about how you translate, once again, a game from the small into a game in the large. Lots of great stuff coming out of France and Canada in terms of this study. It's a fascinating field to me. It allows us to have mathematical machinery that's a lot more elegant than trying to do the stuff we've been doing for climate modeling and for weather patterns and tornadoes. And it's pretty exciting stuff. It hasn't produced a lot of any commercial results so far as I know, maybe in financial mathematics. And I've been studying a lot of that. So I'm hoping that for me, I'm not going to be the guy that comes up with a model that helps everything, but I'm hoping that when the model starts to move forward, I'll be able to say something interesting about it and participate in that conversation, because the mathematics is really fascinating. It's a new way of looking at large sets of actors and many agent phenomenon, which is exactly what we have with climate change. Lots of agents acting in their own best interest.
You talked about when we were having our preliminary chat, and I love this because I would like to talk about social problems are multivariate problems, and maybe I'm not the mathematician, but maybe cubed multivariate problems. And you gave that great example of P versus pi. Can you kind of talk about the complexity of the problems? Like, for example, with them, getting, racial bias and everything. And I would submit that race, even politics, can be accounted for at the genetic level, at the DNA level. So when we look at these problems, people are wired, at least initially, to do things like humans are pattern makers. I read Frank McCourt's fantastic book, Angela's Ashes. If you guys haven't read that book, it's fantastic. It's so good. But the racism and bigotry in that book is about where you're from in Ireland, what your religion was, what kind of house you had. It's not racism per se, but it's what we do. I don't know that. I don't trust that. I don't like that. F you.
Right.
And then we can evolve past that, as you said. So how do you get past that? So some racism is just a product of society, but some is just because that's how we got to this point, by going bad, good, And so,
it's healthy in different societies to be mistrusting of new people. There's a healthy response to that, right? And if you want to abstract it away from people because you want to say, oh no, how could that possibly be true? Let's put it this way. If you're living in a natural setting, like your tribalistic living, it is healthy to be wary of any new animal you've come across, right? If it's a new animal, you're going to look at it and see how big are its teeth. Does it have claws? Does it seem docile? And you're going to spend some time being wary of that thing. If it just walks into your campfire, you're going to be afraid of it at first. And that's healthy. That's, genetic pre-programming, and you should be. And the reason you're wary of it is you're not sure of its capabilities, right? I mean, it's the obvious stuff. It's so obvious when I say it like that. When I say it about, oh, here's a new person walking in, then we have a modern sensibility that says, oh, you can't think that way. It's like,
can I jump in on this real quick?
Yeah,
my daughter and I have an example for this, and we call him Caveman. His name is Kevin.
Yeah.
And he was the guy that tried shit. And it's like, okay, try rocks. Bad? Okay, everybody don't eat rocks. How about this rock that's in the fire pit? Burns my tongue. Don't eat that. And so like you have these where you learn like this snake is horrible. It will bite you. This snake bites you, and it's not as horrible. And so you kind of rebuilt patterns. Sorry, please continue.
No, you're totally right. And I love the movie Encino Man too. So, but more, I loved Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer. But I mean, Kevin, the real lesson isn't people going, hey, look at how stupid Kevin is. His tongue's all burnt. The real lesson is Kevin didn't have any kids. There's no grandchildren of Kevin now because he didn't make it. So like this notion that you're going to be wary of something that's unusual, really, really healthy. You should be kind of wary, but you should also be socialized. So like then what kicks in? So like I've learned that that Sandra is actually pretty nice. She walked into my campfire. She's actually pretty nice. She's not really a threat to me. How do I pass that on? I can pass that on through direct example, but if I needed to get to my grandchildren, the fact that we have the language that creates this cultural history allows us to shape our instincts into a more socially acceptable behavior. So now the grandchildren of Sandra and the grandchildren of Brian are able to talk to each other in a nice way. So the racism that started off there can be overcome culturally. We know this to be true, again and again and again and again. But it's also let's not be ridiculous and think that there's not a reason for it. There's not a reason way deep down inside why people are a little bit xenophobic, why people are a little bit fearful, why people are, too impulsive. It doesn't make sense to sit there and calculate the running velocity of a lion before you decide to run away. Just run.
More complexity to this, though. I mean, a lot of the narrative now inserts racism to defeat racism. We can't feed intolerance into the machine, right, the system, and expect tolerance to come out. Like, we have to everybody can work on being more tolerant, and even of ideas that make you uncomfortable, because if you feed in intolerance, it's as simple as the garbage in, garbage out. And let's all understand, intolerance, for the most part, in terms of social problems, does not help solve the problem.
Absolutely. Well, we were doing a thing on addiction and recovery. We were doing a mental health play. We've been working on that for a while. And in doing that, I researched all of the existing recovery programs. And because those are big behavioral change programs, right? And it turns out that, AA is the most successful recovery program of any sort of rehabilitation program out there that I was able to find. I'm pretty sure that's supported. I don't think I'll be challenged on that one. AA is great. And one of the central tenets of AA is, I can't think my way into better acting, but I can act my way into better thinking. And so when I'm looking at things around social and economic factors, and stupid things that I do, or things that I look at myself and say I wasn't my best self when I did that, the note I try to make to myself and the note I try to make to other people is just act differently the next time. Like, just act differently. Even if you're feeling super racist, act non-racist. Just do that. You know what I mean? Like, just do it. And that will get you to this place where you're not feeling that bile in your stomach. We know this. Again, this is another very commonly studied phenomenon. Act your way into better thinking. And nobody has to know.
I want to jump in on this too. I keep doing this to you, but these are important illustration points. I want to be delicate with the time. I do a thought exercise with myself and other people that I've learned to do through my time in conflict zones. And I'll give you a scenario. When I say your team wins the world championship and there's rioting, what do you see? And it's a motherfucker, because you're like, I am the worst person on earth. You see things that are just completely unfair, and totally ignore most of the rest of the population, or whatever that outcome is. And you can do this for any number of things, where you just invent these things out of whole cloth as to like who is doing what and what's happening. And it's like, if you think you're not a horrible monster person, just do some of those thought exercises, and you quickly understand we have to readjust our thinking. Just like the assumptions we would make about folks who lived in a natural environment or whatever. You're in Afghanistan. What do I think I know about this person? Well, I think they're stupid. Okay, well, that's a false narrative right from the start. I didn't start with that belief. I had to go, oh, that's not right. So here's an example. We would go out and dig wells for people. This is a good thing. They need fresh water. Okay, well, that's where the problems start, because no one asked anybody if they needed a well, nor did they ask them where they should put it. And then when they ignore the well, or they smash the well to pieces because they don't want to die because of the well, we think dumb people aren't able to work. And it's, you get all these absolutely false, conclusions that come out of this thing because of our own understanding of what's there, without taking the time to even ask the fucking question as like, hey, what would be the number one thing you guys need here? Feed and seed. Oh, okay. Not a well. Oh, we got water for days. We could get water out of the valley a little easier. Do you have a pump? Oh shit, we got pumps for days. We
got tons of pumps. Why would you want those?
For days. But you'd have to go to your government and ask for it. Wait, that guy over there, he never does anything. Well, he has access to the pumps. See you later. And then you walk away, and then they go to the government, and you have this tiny little win. But if you start off with they're dumb and they don't know how to do anything, that's where we all fail. We all fail that way.
Totally. And once again, I'm both envious and horrified by the idea of having shared your experience. Like, I would love to have that learning directly, because that's really sort of enviable that you were able to see these belief systems so directly exposed. But at the same time, I would, I don't think I have the stomach for that kind of thing.
Liminality and like liminal space?
I don't think I know that term. No.
It's you enter into someone else's reality. So like, if I come to Verdant and I'm hanging out, I'm in your guys' kind of reality bubble. And if I'm able to translate that to like, say, like an investor that you guys are trying to pitch, You know, they can't travel into the space. I can, because, you know, I'm foreign to both things. And so I'm able to pop into different liminal spaces. So the Afghan space, I can pop into that, understand their reality, and then communicate that back to the military, State Department, whatever, so that they can just kind of nudge. The realities will probably never overlap, but I can nudge them closer together so that they can work more collaboratively. It's impossible to do because everybody hates it when you do it, because
Yeah.
they replace their reality for yours. But, you know, you try to create those scenarios. That's the kind of agent of change you need, though, is someone who's a liminal traveler, who's comfortable and can tolerate alternate realities. And that sounds way more weird than it's supposed to be, but that's how I can explain it.
Now, whatever, hippie. No, you know, it's funny you bring that up, because there's two examples that I know we're short on time, but let me jam out two examples really quick. The first one is, I used to teach a class for incoming graduate students at UCLA on how to teach mathematics. And one of the things I used to say to them is, you know, it's the easiest way in the world to intimidate somebody is to put math in front of them, right? Because people have associated that with their intelligence and thence their self-worth. And it's a bogus equivalence, but it's how it works. So you have to respect that you as a teacher are presenting a terrifying subject to many of them. And they're not less intelligent than you are. They're just they're less experienced. And you have to bring them into your world of how we talk about math. And it's the interface that's hard, not really the ideas. But, you know, so that was always edifying to the student, or at least I hope it was edifying to the students. That was a very arrogant thing to say, my apologies. That appeared to be edifying to the students, that they would feel relieved that now that they're becoming the graduate students and they're going to be the teachers, that they didn't have this mantle on their shoulders, but they did have a responsibility sort of to bring it forward. But on a less serious note, nobody gets killed in this example. Nobody feels I'm a huge fan of like paranormal shows.
Nice.
I don't believe in anything. I don't believe in ghosts. I mean, I believe ghosts happen as a phenomenon. I don't believe in the afterlife. I don't believe Bigfoot exists. You know, maybe I'm wrong. I don't believe in, but I love watching people convince themselves
Yes.
Of how that must have been a Bigfoot that we heard knocking, right? You know, that must have, I have a $5 bet going with my daughter that they found Bigfoot in the show Finding Bigfoot, and that's why they canceled the show. And but you know, why do they believe that every sound is a Bigfoot? It's because it's a belief system they have. And that's a much safer one to walk in and out of. You know, even the conspiracy theories are kind of fun to walk in and out of, and kind of, you know, the whole Skinwalker Ranch thing, you're like, this is ridiculous. It's clear that they're, you know, deluding themselves on multiple fronts. But you walk in, you go, why are they doing that? That's an interesting place. It's much easier to sort of to do that sort of liminal traveling than it is to, like, you know, play with people's lives in the fields of Afghanistan. Well, not play. I know, you know, like, you're sort of affecting them, and I commend you for doing so, and I thank you for doing so. But man, that sounds scary to me.
Yeah. I love to watch the moon landing conspiracy stuff, especially when they cut to the NASA guy. They're like, "How come we can't see stars?" And the guy's just like, "Okay, all right, let's go." The moon is very bright, right? We can see it. It's like, and he goes in next, but like every time, the person is just like, my face is gonna explode if I don't hold it together right now.
Oh yeah, I listen to a lot of these podcasters. There's this great podcast called Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. And one of the things that they is a constant theme is they invite skeptics onto these shows to be basically a piñata, and they edit the hell out of them, and, like, you know, trying to tell you even this scientist believes that it could be aliens.
Yeah,
come on.
Yeah.
You know, but it's such an effort to get there, to believe that this is a ghost, or this is something paranormal, or this is a, you know, skinwalker. This is, and the you know what, I know we're going over the racism in a lot of these beliefs is so amazing, especially when it comes to American Indians and trying to cast American Indians as these supernatural creatures, rather than, you know, they have like, it was an Indian burial ground, and that's why it's haunted. It's like, they're just people. They're people, right? They were good, they were bad, but they're people. Don't try to call them like some sort of child of the earth. There's something more than they are. They're people, and you're being racist when you other them like that. So maybe that should be my final thought on that.
If you want to ever determine someone's level of understanding about what race is and all that kind of stuff, just say, are Indians Asians? And then that's it. It breaks their brain. And then if it doesn't break their brain, how about people from Yemen? How about people from Oman? Are they Asians? No, of
Yeah.
course not. Okay. Well, there we
Yeah.
go. You know.
Because the term has no implicit meaning, right? You know, like
How about if you're from Timor-Leste? You're closer to Australia than anywhere else in Asia. Are they
Mhm.
Asians? Yes, they
Yeah.
are. You know, but
Great.
no, they're not. Oh, okay.
But no,
Great.
they're
All
not.
right.
How could they be, Pete? What are you talking about? Of course they are.
Sandra, you were allowed to ask one question this whole
That's
episode.
it. You're not getting another one.
That is just fine. That is just fine. I enjoyed the discussion thoroughly, as always, and thank you for letting me be a fly on the wall. So
Thanks for putting the backpack on me and make me do all the work.
Come on.
Sandra's wonderful. I
Yeah.
never get enough time with Sandra, and it's great. Let's do more of these. It's just
Yes.
always fun. You bring such interesting people on the show. And Brian, you're one of those people. So interesting,
Oh
so
my God,
fascinating.
me?
I could talk to you all day.
Hey, I've been really enjoying this conversation, and I know that from like a certain level, it was really, as my wife would say, rangy. And we went
Yeah.
everywhere, but I really enjoyed it, Pete. So thank you so much for having me and letting me sort of run my mouth on weird topics. If anybody wants to hear me run my mouth on weird topics, I'm pretty easy to find.
How do they find you? What's the best place?
So verdant.ai, Vertant.ai. I'm sure it'll go in show notes or something like that. We're pretty easy to reach. Just reach out to us there. We're all over social media. We are implicitly curious people. So we talk about science, we talk about math, we talk about products more primarily because that's our business. But, we talk about art, we talk about history, we talk about sociology. These are things that you'll find even within our blog. If you read through it, we never do a straight up like, this is how a product works blog. It's always like, here's some cultural touch points. Here's some other things you hopefully didn't consider when you were considering this particular aspect of how to build a database. So we're just sort of interested people, hopefully interesting as well.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being interesting. I'm going to sign off here. So everybody stand by.
Thank you.
Thank you.